Mary Ricketts was a woman of logic and science, but in the summer of 1765, she moved into a house that would eventually force her to flee for her life. She documented everything in a journal that would stay hidden for 100 years, and what researchers found inside changed how we look at hauntings forever. The house was called Hinton Ampner. Mary, a highly educated woman from London, she was sharp, practical, and completely skeptical of ghost stories. Her husband had to travel to Jamaica on business, leaving Mary alone to run the estate. She expected peace and quiet. Instead, she walked into a historical mystery that would eventually force her to flee for her life. It started with sounds that didn't make sense. In the dead of night, Mary would wake up to the distinct rustling of a heavy, stiff silk dress dragging slowly across the floorboards right outside her bedroom door. Then came the footsteps, walking up and down the grand staircase, when everyone in the house was fast asleep. Now, a standard horror story would have the character scream and run, right? But not Mary. She didn't believe in ghosts, and assumed someone was trying to break in, or that her servants were playing a trick on her. So she took a completely logical approach. She ordered every single lock in the house to be replaced. She kept the keys on her person at all times, and yet the noises kept happening. Mary began keeping a private journal, documenting the anomalies like a scientist. She noted that the servants were getting terrified, claiming to see a shadowy man in a drab-coloured coat appearing in the dark corridors and vanishing into thin air. Soon, the haunting finally followed Mary into her own bedroom. On several occasions, she woke up to the sound of 3 distinct voices whispering right next to her bed. She wrote in her diary that she could hear the clear, shifting tones of a conversation. She could tell people were speaking, but the words themselves were muffled, as if they were being spoken through a thick wall. The true turning point of the Hinton Ampner mystery happened when Mary's brother came to visit. His name was Captain John Jervis. He wasn't a man who frightened easily. He was a highly respected, hardened naval officer, a military man who would later become a famous admiral and mentor to Lord Nelson. When Captain Jervis heard the servants gossiping about a ghost, he scoffed. He told his sister that it was likely smugglers using hidden passages in the old manor walls. He loaded his service pistols, stayed up late, and vowed to catch the intruders. But the house was waiting for him. That night, Captain Jervis and a friend rushed toward the sound of a violent crash in the house. Armed with pistols, they searched every square inch. The doors were still locked from the inside. The windows were barred. Nothing had been moved. Yet the sounds continued, heavy thuds, dragging noises, and a strange, cold presence that brushed right past the hardened military captain in the dark. The next morning, the naval officer walked down the stairs, looked at his sister, and told her they had to leave. If a man who faced enemy warships was telling her the house wasn't safe, Mary knew it was time to go. Mary Ricketts abandoned Hinton Ampner in 1771. The house sat completely empty for years because no local tenant would dare step inside. Finally, in 1793, the owner gave up and ordered the entire mansion to be demolished. But the final piece of documentation is perhaps the most chilling. As the labourers were tearing down the foundations, pulling up the floorboards directly beneath the floor, where Mary and her brother had heard the terrifying crashes, they found a small, hidden cavity. Inside was a single box, and inside that box was the skull of a small child. The grand house was gone, but Mary's journals survived, preserved by her family for generations. It leaves us with a quiet, unsettling truth. The horrors of Hinton Ampner weren't made up by Hollywood. They were written down, day by day, by a woman who tried her best not to believe them. You might think the story ends with that chilling discovery, but what happened to Mary and John after they left is just as telling. After fleeing the terror of Hinton Ampner in 1771, Mary Ricketts did not want to take any chances. She moved her children completely away from the isolated countryside and settled into a secure, elegant townhome in London. Her brother, Captain John Jervis, went right back to sea. He focused entirely on his naval career, eventually rising to become the First Lord of the Admiralty and one of the most famous naval heroes in British history, earning the grand title of Earl of St. Vincent. For Mary and John, the ghosts stayed behind the second they walked out the door of Hinton Ampner. The entity seemed bound entirely to the grounds of that specific manor house. However, while the footsteps and whispering voices stayed behind, the psychological toll remained. Family letters show that Mary remained deeply affected by what she experienced for the rest of her life, rarely speaking of the house aloud to outsiders. Both lived long lives, John into his late 80s, passing away in March 1823, and Mary aged 86 just a year after him in March 1824, proving that whatever was in that house, it didn't follow them to the grave. For nearly a century, Mary's meticulous, day-by-day diary of the haunting remained a strictly guarded family secret. Because John Jervis was a massive national hero, the family was deeply terrified that if Mary's ghost stories became public, it would tarnish the legendary admiral's reputation and make the family look foolish. The journals were locked away in a private family archive for decades. It wasn't until 1872, long after Mary, her brother, and her children had passed away, that a descendant named Crownlessly Jervis finally permitted the family papers to be examined. The diary was published in a Victorian periodical called The Gentleman's Magazine. When researchers read Mary's calm, level-headed, and scientific documentation of the events, backed up by the signed testimonies of a legendary naval hero, the Hinton Ampner case instantly became recognized as one of the most credible, authoritative historical hauntings ever recorded. Mary and her brother escaped the physical walls of Hinton Ampner, living out long, quiet lives in the safety of London and the open sea. The entity never followed them. But the truth couldn't stay buried forever. Hidden away for 100 years to protect a family's noble name, Mary's diary finally came to light in 1872. It stands today not as a piece of folklore, but as a chilling historical record written by a skeptic who couldn't deny what she lived through. And finally, what happened to the house? After the original was demolished, the new house was built a short distance away. The site of the old house became an orchard. However, on 3rd of April 1960, Hinton Ampner was badly damaged in a fire, with all rooms affected by fire and smoke. It was rebuilt and renovated and reopened in 1963. The house then passed to the care of the National Trust in 1985. Thank you for watching. Good night.